Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatore. So I'm always learning, and the reason I'm making this video is, I think I know a fair amount about Victorian swords at this point, and probably most other people would agree with that, but I'm always learning, and one of the things I love about sort of delving into a specific field and getting really deep into it is that you're literally always learning stuff, and no matter how much you think you know, you're always going to find out new stuff, and sometimes have to relearn things that you thought you knew because things challenge that. Now, one of those, an example of that is something that came up this week. So I acquired a sword which in due course is almost certainly going to be for sale on my website, Eastern Antique Arms, link below, but this isn't an ad. And it's a nice 1857 pattern Royal Engineers officer's sword with an 1845 pattern fullered blade, and when I saw it, it was obviously negotiated on the price. It was I got it for a price that I thought I could sell it on at, and it was a really nice sword. If I just dispense with the scabbard for a minute, it does need cleaning up, and it will be cleaned up imminently. In fact, that's one of the things I might be doing today. But so it's in quite grubby condition, but it's a very, very nice example of a Royal Engineers 1857 pattern officer's sword. And all the shagreen's there, all the grip wire. It's got the beautiful brass scroll hilt that was famous for Royal Engineers. In fact, a lot of the gilding still remains on the inside of the guard and on some parts of the backstrap and the pommel in all of the recesses. Gilding is essentially gold that's applied to the surface of the brass. That usually rubs off with age. Usually entirely, in fact, it rubs off relatively easily, it has to be said, and it would have rubbed off within the service life of the sword. And and this one's got quite a lot remaining. So anyway, it's very nice condition. The blade needs a bit of cleaning. It's quite grubby. It's got quite a lot of kind of old gunky grease on it at the moment. But it is made by the maker Pillin, who were a, let's say, rival competitor of Wilkinson. So they were a top level maker. In fact, in due course, Pillin weren't as big a company as Wilkinson, and Wilkinson essentially bought them out eventually. But Pillin made blades as good quality as Wilkinson. Some people would say better. I'm sure Pillin themselves would have said. In fact, Alfred Hutton, in one of his manuals, he recommends Wilkinson, and in another one of his manuals, he recommends Pillin. So anyway, they were up there. So very good quality blades, known for their blade quality. Often Pillin swords were bought by officers who kind of meant business and who had an interest in swords or thought that they might need them. So if they were going to India or somewhere a little bit more dangerous. And the blade is heavily etched, sort of extra detailed etching. Pillin, manufacturer, London, says down the bottom, and it has the person's initials and crest. So as well as being a nice Royal Engineers officer's sword, in nice condition, although in need of a clean, and by a good maker, my eyes also lit up because it had the initials and the crest on the blade, which means that it's hopefully identifiable. Now, I have to qualify that for a second, because a lot of swords that I have had identifying marks on them, but I've never succeeded in pinning it to an individual. That could be for a number of reasons. If you've just got initials, sometimes you might look through the army lists of the British Army officers lists, and you find that sometimes there are more than one person with those initials, and the sword could have, because of the timing and the regiment, it could have belonged to either person. So sometimes you can only narrow it down and you never know precisely. Sometimes you have initials or a crest and you never manage to match those to a person in the records. It could be sometimes because they haven't listed all of their names or initials in one of the records or on the sword. In terms of crests, sometimes it seems that people didn't legitimately have College of Arms. They weren't granted a crest or a heraldic device, but they looked one up and they thought, I like that, and they used that. So unofficially. So in some cases the crest doesn't really match the name according to the official records. So anyway, there's many reasons why sometimes we can't match these to an individual, but there's one other key factor. So number one, it's a Royal Engineers model sword. Number two, it's actually marked Engineer Volunteers. Now the Engineer Volunteers are actually less numerous than the Royal Engineers. So if you think about, in Britain, we talk about what we used to call the territorial army, or the volunteers essentially, or the regular army. You've got a similar thing in America and various other countries. So you've got regular army who's day in, day out, 5 days a week or even 7 days a week, their job is to be in the army. And then you've got the other people, the reservists essentially. And in the Victorian period, it was exactly the same. You had these kind of militia or yeomanry units that were, they had day jobs. They were normal civilians, but in their spare time, a bit like being in the Scouts or something, in the spare time, they basically gave military service. But in the Victorian period, just as it has to be said in modern times as well, sometimes reservists are called upon to actually do real military service. So they were kind of training for real, but they were just doing it part-time instead of full-time. So here we've got engineer volunteers, and we've got initials, 3 initials, JHP, and the crest. And anyway, so I set to work looking through the army lists. Now, this is where my knowledge has been challenged. So the first thing I do when I've got that information is I think, okay, what date is the sword? Because the army lists started in fact, they go all the way back to the Napoleonic period, but the Hart's annual army list starts really in the 1840s and goes right the way through to the First World War. So it covers most of the period that I'm usually researching. So I have to think, okay, well, which army list? There's one every year. Which one am I going to look at? Because clearly, if I'm looking at a 1855 army list and the officer didn't join the army until 1885, I'm not going to find them. So you have to have a rough idea of the date of the sword. Now, looking at this sword, I know it's 1857 pattern. So I know it dates to after 1857. Okay. So I have to, between 1857 and the end of Victorian's reign, I know it's Victorian, so 1901. So as a very rough guide, I could narrow that down to 1857 to 1901. But I've got a few more clues. It's an 1845 pattern blade, and officially they were replaced in 1892. Not replaced so much as superseded. So people buying new swords, in other words, officers who were commissioning into the army after 1892, bought the new straight thrusting blade. I'll just grab one of those so you know what I'm talking about. So here is this is for rifles. Here is a 1892 thrusting blade. And you can see it's a different shape. It's straight, it's tapering, it's pointy, it has a central filler. Here it's in fact completely blunt up to there and then only edged beyond that. This incidentally is a Edward VII period one, so between 1901 and 1910, and it's service sharpened, so probably saw service either in the Boer War or in World War I, probably, but I have yet to research this one. So here we go back to the engineer sword. So it's an 1845 pattern blade that was officially in use until 1892. For Royal Engineers anyway. It continued in use for cavalry, the cavalry-sized version, until later. Right, so we've got some date ranges there. So I started searching. Well, the first thing is I'd never really researched much about the militia engineers or Royal Engineer volunteers. I'd never really researched them before. So I started looking in the what I thought the probable date of this sword was. I thought it was probably maybe mid-1860s, maybe 1870s. Okay, just from the look of it. So I looked at the shape of the sword, the curve of the blade, the style of the etching. I thought this is a mid-Victorian sword. I thought 1860s, 1870s. Pillin were around before 1860, but they didn't really come big onto the scene until 1862. So, and also this has got, it doesn't have an address on it, but some of them do. We know it's in London, but they moved street. So I thought 1860s to 1870s, and I started researching and I found nothing. But moreover, I found no militia engineers. So upon further investigation, I learnt that essentially, with sort of generally speaking, the militia volunteers, the militia engineers, so the volunteer engineers, didn't really start in Britain until 1877. Now, they did sort of exist before that, but not as an official entity. So 1877, so I started at 1870. I thought, yep, that's fine. This sword could be late 1870s. To me, it looks earlier. But anyway, I'll start researching. I went through the years, 1877, 78, 79, 80. Can't find anyone with a matching initials. And bear in mind, I'm looking for those initials JHP. And then I'm searching, if I find, in theory, I didn't find any, but if I find someone with those initials and the surname matches, I then look at that surname and look at the crests associated with that surname. So let's say I find a John Henry Parker. I go and search for the name Parker and family crests associated with the name Parker and see if any of those crests match that crest and motto there. And if they do, I've found my man, okay? But I didn't find any JHPs. I even looked at other options. Maybe that's not a J. I could see that's definitely a P at the end, which is good. The last initial is the most important because that's the surname and that's attached to the crest. I thought the middle letter could have been a K or an H. I wasn't sure. Anyway, I went searching through the list and it got later and later and later. I went through the 1880s and I got into the 1890s and I thought, well, this sword was superseded in 1892 by a new thrusting blade like the one I just showed. But there eventually, in 1896, in fact I skipped a few, I couldn't find a couple of years, so I kind of skipped from 1892, I ended up in 1895, the scan wasn't very good, so I ended up looking at 1896, so I skipped from 1892 to 96, so I skipped 4 years. And eventually there in 1896, under the Militia Engineers for the Plymouth Division was my JHP, and it was John Harvey Pryor, then Lieutenant in the Submarine Miners. So I'll talk about that in a second. And so I found my person, and obviously I looked up the crests associated with the name Pryor. I didn't find an exact match, but I found some very close ones, close enough to convince me there was no doubts here that this was the person. It was the right initials, a very, very similar crest, and it can only be that person really. And just to reiterate, the engineer volunteers, also known as the militia engineers, were small. There weren't many of them at any one time. The number of officers, and they increased in size slightly over the years from 1877 to 1896. But in 1877, there were only 2 divisions. And so we're not talking about many. We're only at the beginning in 1877, we're only talking about 20 officers, something like that. Very, very small. Very, very small outfit. Much smaller than the Royal Engineers, which was an enormous thing with many divisions all over the world, as well as Bengal Engineers and Bombay Engineers and all of the others. And even in Malta and Gibraltar and all of the places where the British Empire needed Royal Engineers officers. So I found my person, basically. But the thing which surprised me was that he commissioned in 1893. So there we go. All of my, not all, but many of my assumptions about this sword had been slightly wrong. Not so much that I couldn't, get down to the bottom of the story and find the truth of who actually owned this sword. But the fact is, John Harvey Pryor didn't commission until 1893, and if I'd just seen that sword in a shop, I never would have thought that dated to 1893. To me, that was 20 or 30 years earlier than that, in terms of its style. So it just goes to show, in some cases, you can't always judge a sword by its scabbard. No, you can't always judge a sword by its shape. I was going to say a book by its cover, but anyway, you can't always judge the exact date of something just by the look of it. Sometimes when you do historical research into something, you'll find that's actually earlier or later than you thought, even in such a well-documented period as the late 1800s and the Victorian British Army. So there we go. Now, the final thing to say, I said I'd mention about the submarine miners. So they, of course, were very interesting. When we talk about submarines, some of you will know that submarines did make their sort of, one of their famous debuts. They made a few debuts, but they used them fleetingly, I think, in the Crimean War as well. But I was going to say in the US Civil War. So submarines were used already in the middle of the 19th century and a little bit earlier than that as well. But by the late 19th century. So we're talking about the 1890s here. It's not that long before the First World War when you think about it. So, you know, often when we talk about late 19th century warfare, we're thinking about things like, you know, certainly in terms of the British Army, sort of fighting dervishes in the Sudan or the Boers in South Africa. But you've got to remember that massive battleships and submarines and these great big engines of war were things which were starting to come onto the horizon and developing very, very quickly. So this sort of clash between the old world and the new. So submarine miners, what they were literally doing was developing fortifications to defend against submarine attack. Because, you know, you read H.G. Wells and you look at the sort of the war in the air and how they perceived aeroplanes or flying machines, which were just only on the cusp of being invented, how they might be used in war. And of course we look at Jules Verne, and you look at Jules Verne and you see submarine, of course, the Nautilus, and the fact that these machines were starting to enter science fiction and people's psyche of, you know, what a modern war might look like. So the Royal Engineers, or in this case the Militia Engineers, were on the forefront of thinking about not only the machines to use against the enemy, but how to defend the nation or wherever from those other weapons of attack, be they weapons of the sea or weapons of the air. So it's a very interesting period actually, but ironically this sword was service sharpened. Now I thought, well, okay, why is a engineers volunteers sword service sharpened? Well, I very quickly found out. So our man, John Harvey Pryor, it turns out he wasn't only a volunteer Royal Engineers, essentially a volunteer engineers officer. He actually went to war, actually like many volunteers in the British Empire did during the Boer War. So during the Boer War, it was such a big deal, obviously just even more, not as much as World War I was, but in a similar way to World War I, that a lot of people who until that point hadn't been in the regular military essentially volunteered their services to fight in the Boer War. And obviously in World War I, this was the same times 1,000, because huge swathes of the population volunteered to fight who'd never fought before, or maybe had retired from the military years prior. So he went to fight in South Africa, and actually he won the DSO, the Distinguished Service Order medal, and he's listed on DSO websites and such like. So from just being a nice sword, I learned an awful lot from researching this. I learned that you can't always date a sword just by looking at it. You've got to research it a bit more, and it's very evident that even though after 1892, given that this dates to 1893, although technically I suppose it could have been made earlier, but this dates to that cusp between the new thrusting blade coming in and the old 1845 blade. So this is like the last of an era for this particular style of sword. And then of course also the preconception that I thought the militia engineers or volunteer engineers went way back, and actually they weren't really founded or made into an official thing until 1877, so quite late in British Army history. And then they grew very rapidly, such that they were very important to national defence by the 1890s. And of course this guy who seemed like, oh, only a volunteer, only a part-timer, he went to war in the Second Anglo-Boer War and won the Distinguished Service Order, won the DSO. You know, so all sorts of interesting things you learn. So anyway, there we go. I'm going to set to cleaning this sword up because it's, as I said, it's quite gunky at the moment. So I'm going to clean this sword up, and it's not for my collection. It's one that I hope someone else will cherish and love. But I've done a good part of the legwork and enjoyed it, of doing the research on it. I hope that's been somewhat interesting, and thanks a lot for watching. See you next time. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.